Hi, I'm Jay, and today we're tying the Pro Football Ice Jig almost live. Stay tuned. And we're back. So, now it's afternoon. You missed a really good session earlier this morning when I'm not smart enough to hit record. But good afternoon. So I'm at the desk and I've been tying for a little while. Let's get all situated here. And this is a jig that we've tied before. It's very simple. It's nothing fancy at all, though it works great. I tie this jig in a 1/32, a 1/16, a 1/8, and sometimes even a 1/4. But this is what I call a football head. It's that minnow profile jig. But as we're talking, as we're tying, the real reason why I decided to turn the cameras on, not just to rehash a jig we've tied before, but a few wraps down towards the bend of the hook and then back, and I stop in the midpoint of my wraps. And for this jig, what I have here is just a medium silver chenille. This is a Danville chenille. I believe for them it's a number 1 or number 2 or number 4, I think. But if you're shopping for chenille, anything in the medium size, you don't need it too thick. We're only putting a wrap or two on this. My first wrap around, I kind of angle it towards the bend of the hook, and then at least 2 more wraps touching back to the head of the jig, and just lock that into place. This is a very simple jig, but it's not the profile on this. It's not a big gob of material. It's just enough to give a little sparkle. The fish will see it. They're going to come from a fair distance. There's going to be the motion in the water. Your jig drops. That collar is going to flash as the light hits it at different angles, at different depths, etc. And then the very easy way to finish this off is we're taking a hackle feather. Now what we're looking for are barbs that are about 1.5 times the hook gap. On this feather, as we get towards the base, that gets a little wide, so I'm going to just kind of strip those away so they're not in my way. And just cut myself the tip. Can lock this in place. 3 wraps towards the bend of the hook, and then 2 wraps. I'm going to angle it so it rubs right along the head of the jig and slides into place, and it sandwiches the tail of that feather, so it's locked in there well. And then you just take your hackle pliers, and you want 2 to 3 good wraps. So 1, 2, 3 is perfect. Again, when you pick up your thread, I'm angling it along the head of the jig so any fibers that are tending to lean forward are captured and pushed back. Let me cut that off the tip and finish this off as normal. I use a loop of thread, but you can also use a whip finish tool since these jigs are small enough. Just 3 wraps to secure it. pulling your tag end through to finish the knot. And that's all there is to this jig. A very simple jig. Some lacquer-based head cement, just a couple drops on the collar. And this jig is how I always describe as an old-timey color. It's that red and white. It just reminds me of, 1975, right? Fishing lures. Everybody had something that was red and white in their box. But there we have the pro football, what we call pro football. And you can see pretty well the fibers there. They extend just past the hook of the jig. It's very nice. We tip these with a waxworm or mousy, some sort of grub or maggot. And it's a go-to jig for ice fishing for me. Every year at the beginning of the season, I'll try to go through all my boxes and my sled and my bag and try to weed out all the extra stuff. Try to tone down. I don't have to carry everything I own out on the ice. I only use 3 or 4 jigs usually at a time and don't touch anything else an entire day, so why carry it, right? But this is a color and a size. It's a jig that I always have in my box. Even in the summertime, I know I have a red and white jig in my summertime tackle box. But for panfish, for perch, there's guys in Florida that will, I do tie, I happen to have one here. Let's see if I can hold it. I do tie these in this size head on a longer shanked hook. So I'll just line up the curve of the hook for each of them, and as you can see, that's a whole half a head length longer. I do tie these jigs up for guys that fish them in Florida through the lily pads and get some giant crappie with them. The same pattern. I'm not sure if I'm assuming they're tipping them with a minnow or something. But the way it was described to me is it sounded just like they were ice fishing through the lily pads. But it was some snowbirds that were coming, that live here in New York half a year and then half a year down in Florida. But I do sell to a couple shops down there. They'll give me a call almost every year for jigs for their shops. So it's a great pattern. It works so well. But the reason I thought I would turn the cameras on, even briefly, is talking about the paint. Now typically almost all my jigs are painted with epoxy, and in the past we would do this pattern with either white and red epoxy, or we would take white epoxy painted heads, and then the nose, there was an enamel an oil-based enamel that we would use, and it would work well. I don't recall the brand. It probably was a Rust-Oleum, I would think. But I'm not sure. Paints, It's strange shopping for paint now. When you go to the stores, there's only one or two brands now really left on the market, at least for the average person. Even if you go to a dedicated paint store, there the tip just broke off. That's not a problem. Just grab it again and rewrap. If I go to a store that's a dedicated paint store, they don't sell epoxy like they used to. You could get maybe those kits to paint the floor of your garage. Sometimes you can find like the gray that you used to paint your porch with, the epoxy paint. But for the most part, like, it's, if you're just an average citizen, you can't find epoxy. You can't find high quality enamel. So it's changed over the years. It's so much harder for someone like me to still buy the same things that I'm used to always having. And it's kind of the same problem I found with the thread. You know, I had such an inventory. I'm happily just tying along for a decade, not realizing that, oh, I can't find 2-aught thread anymore. The industry has changed a little bit. Companies like Danville, who are still in business, don't make a 2-aught round nylon thread like they used to. Very strange how things change like that. I would have never have guessed it. And I guess in some regard, you know, maybe I was naive. I don't know. But, goodness. Talking about the paint. I still paint the majority of my jigs with epoxy. Though, over the last few years, we've noticed, and I've done videos where I have the airbrush painted heads. And one of these days, we'll have to set the cameras up in the table behind me. And I'll have to figure out a way to do the audio, or, you know, run a long hose and move my compressor to the far side of the house, right? So you could hear me talk, but you know, one of these days we'll sit down and I'll actually show how, you know, we're painting heads like the perch head. Okay, but I've really been impressed with the water-based enamel, the brand that I've been using. Regarding its durability, you know, it's not as durable as a powder paint, though neither is epoxy. If I fish with an epoxy painted jig head and I'm dragging it across the river bottom or the lake bottom, catching walleye all morning, it's only a matter of time before the paint's starting to chip and scratch and wear out. It's just the nature of the paint. It's still pretty darn durable. So, with the water-based enamels that we've been using, and then using the diamond clear coat, it's very, very similar. I'd venture to argue it's about the same as epoxy in terms of durability. Yes, you can, you know, again, if I'm airbrushing these heads and dragging the jig across the river bottom all morning long, yes, you're going to scratch the paint. You catch a great big northern on it, yeah, those teeth are going to scratch the paint. but it's pretty durable. So what am I getting at? Over the years with epoxy, one problem we've always had is that there's no such thing as a fluorescent epoxy. So any of the fluorescent jigs, here's an example of an old teardrop jig. Those have always been painted with a buoy paint, which was super durable. It was an enamel. It was paint used to paint buoys that you throw out in the bay. The fluorescent properties were fantastic because it was for a safety buoy, right? That paint has become terribly expensive. I can get it, no problem. But I think the last time I checked, a gallon was in the $70 range, which isn't the end of the world. You know, a gallon for me would last 10 years. If it doesn't get ruined in that time. It's very finicky. A very finicky paint to use. A very finicky paint to keep alive. It's almost like one of those dumb electronic, what were they called? The little electronic eggs that you'd have to feed and play with and do all that stuff. And if you weren't paying attention to it, after a few days it dies. It's the same thing. It's the same thing with fluorescent paint. If you don't shake the can every 2 weeks, if you forget, by the 4th week, you better open that can and take a stick and make sure it's stirred completely. Like, spend, a half hour stirring it, making sure that everything is mixed properly and it hasn't started to harden in parts of the can, etc. There's a lot of effort to keep fluorescent paint usable, the buoy paint. Other problems that I'd have with it, so I would have the gallon of buoy paint, and I would have a small pint jar, a glass pint jar to put the paint in for the paint that I'm going to use. So that pint jar I could do hundreds of eyes with, let's say, or I could paint a few dozen jigs or more without having to add more to it, just to save from opening the big can, because every time you take the lid off, you risk adding impurities and oxygen and air and all the stuff that ruins your can of paint or reduces its lifespan, right? But then that little jar, again, you had to shake it every 2 weeks, same as with the can that was on the shelf. But as it got older, if you tried to thin it, you might get lucky 2 or 3 times. You can just thin it down a little bit, especially when I'm painting, a jig like this. So this is buoy paint. So the fluorescent yellow, painting it, keeping the consistency of the paint the same. So when you brush it on, it's a nice candy shell. There's no streaks. There's no differences in the color, like chunks that were brighter and chunks that were less clear, kind of spotty looking. Because if you tried to thin it so you could brush it on nicely, you get just a little too much thinner, and all of a sudden all those particles just separate. So it was like painting with nail polish with glitter in it. That's what it would look like. It would look like clear with the fluorescent yellow chunks, like all separated. And so then that was ruined. There's no bringing that back around. If that happened to your gallon, $70 gallon, well, then that's ruined, right? So even though we've used it for years, I used it for years and years, it was very difficult to use. So always tried to find an alternative. Epoxy, there was no fluorescent epoxy that I've ever found. Other paints just weren't durable enough. Water-based epoxies, for example. You'd find great epoxy paints, especially in the 70s, right, with all the hippies. So you'd find all these craft paints, super bright fluorescent colors, but you couldn't clear coat them. They weren't durable. They didn't adhere to metal, to lead. Let's pause a brief moment just so I could show you. So I'm looking for feathers, the fibers, to be 1.5 times the hook gap. Again, this feather a lot wider at the bottom, but I'm going to concentrate on just wrapping about 2/3 of this feather. Will fit this jig head just perfectly. So fluorescent colors and the airbrush paints. The airbrush brand that I've been using has a fantastic line of fluorescent paints. I've used some of those colors on painting the airbrushed walleye heads. So the jig head with the glow tinsel, that fluorescent chartreuse with the glow tinsel, and then the, what else uses one of the fluorescent colors? Just the straight, well, here's a test that I did. These heads are just a regular chartreuse. This is actually a different brand of paint, which I also kind of like, but I don't think I'm going to use it fairly regularly. So this is just a solid, just a green chartreuse. And actually on the top of this one I added a second coat of a little bit darker green chartreuse. This paint was from Do It. Actually, Do It has their own label of airbrush paint. But doing head colors like this, so, you know, trying different things, using this airbrush paint that I've been using for the airheads, the walleye head jigs that we've done, videos in the past, have been working out really well. I do clear coat them, right, with the diamond coat. Has worked fantastic. I was happy to kind of learn of it. I figured if the guys that do the big plugs for pike, if they use the diamond coat to coat their pike lures with, if it was good enough for that, I figured it'd be good enough for jigs, and I've been happy with it. So getting to where we are at, particularly with just the simple product of our ice jigs. So I painted these up. The jig I have in the vise is just an old-timey color, red and white. I've talked about these before. A recent video, I tied a marabou jig on the same size head. It was a white jig with a black nose. That was epoxy paint. The black and the white both were epoxy. So I guess where are we going with this? So epoxy paint has some difficulties of its own. It dries with a chemical reaction, so once it's mixed, you got a little bit, maybe a little bit longer than an hour to use. If I was painting the white, maybe I could stretch it out to 2 hours because you're just brushing it on. There is a reducer that you could use with epoxy. You can thin it down slightly. But you can't. It's terribly hard to reduce it to keep it from drying, because really the drying is created with that chemical reaction, which has nothing to do with the air. So brushing on the white, the epoxy worked just fine. Painting this nose, we do this pattern on the football head jigs, the shaped head here, as well as the shad darts that we cast. And it's just an old-timey pattern. I don't know why this paint pattern seems to work. There's days where the fish are biting nothing but this type of pattern. I could use the same color combination, maybe a white head with a red eye or a white head with red stripes, and the fish ignore it. But I use the jig with the nose, and I'm catching fish all day long, right? Another good color combination that I love on the ice jig, fluorescent yellow with an orange nose. That is summer, winter, fall, spring, doesn't matter what time of year, that color always seems to work. So paints, and in particular the fluorescents, or paints, and particularly this pattern with the dip nose. So I started doing some tests. This is a test. This dozen or so, couple dozen that I have hanging here, is a test. When I was painting jigs just the other day, happened to have some red in my cup. I have mixing cups, kind of like the little food cups that you put ketchup in. The little tiny cups have a clear plastic lid. Sometimes you get, your bait, you get little maggots in that little food service cup. I mix my paint in a container like that, and then pour it into my airbrush. Just making sure everything's recording. So I happen to have some white heads that I had painted, and I was going to do just a solid. I got them sitting there waiting to get the fluorescent yellow and chartreuse. Those two different color heads. All of those were getting eyes, and then they get the clear coat. But I was thinking, would this paint be okay doing the nose? Epoxy paint works fine, but if you thin it out, you have to be a little bit careful. So, you dip your nose, you hang the jig, dip your nose, hang the jig. After a dozen or so, you then have to take a tongue depressor or a popsicle stick and kind of reach into your rack there and touch the noses of each of your jigs, because the epoxy paint, if it was a little bit too thin or a little bit too thick, as it hangs there, it develops a little bit of a bump, a little bit of a drip. So you go with a popsicle stick and you touch it at least once, sometimes twice, just to make sure that it would cure without that bump, because that bump is a soft spot now. Not only does it make your jig head look deformed, if you end up fishing with it, that bump automatically will chip. As soon as it hits a rock, it's just going to chip right off. So I had my little container. Now this is almost live, so let me change gears here. As you can see, I tried to take my loop of thread and I'm putting it underneath my last wrap, and it took a lot of coaxing to get that under. If I wasn't able to get it under at this point because it was tight, right? If it doesn't go, I can just give it one more wrap, very loose wrap, so I can easily take my thread and put it up through there. It's not a lot of wraps on this. I'm not trying to build up a collar. Back to the paint. So I had that little cup of leftover red paint, just a little bit in the bottom. So I dipped it and had a popsicle. I did have a popsicle stick on my table, but I dipped it, touched the popsicle stick, hung it. That's the only steps that I did. I walked away, made a coffee, had lunch, I don't know, let the dogs out, something, and just forgot about the jigs. Came back later in the afternoon just to look, and there was no drip. I wasn't checking it for drips, so I'm like, okay, let me do a few of these. So it actually was. I was doing a lot of airbrushing that day. I actually had some black in a cup after painting something different. So then I took some more of those white jigs and dipped a whole bunch. Kept painting, but I would keep an eye on them, looking at them. They dried perfectly. They dried nicely. A nice candy coat on the nose. Don't know how well that comes out, but it's a nice candy coat on the nose. There's no drip, there's no deformed nose. It's coated well, so down the center of the middle, often if your paint was too thin, you'd see that white showing through, and it would look a little bit uneven and thin in spots. But that looked pretty good. And then I clear coat it, and that's what we're tying today. So I know that seems to work. I'm going to practice a little bit. Use some of the other colors. Use some of the colors like this. This is one of the buoy painted jigs with a fluorescent dot on a fluorescent yellow jig. I think those will look fine. I am going to have to practice a little bit to see, or test a little bit to see how well the clear coat will cover the black Sharpie lines that we put on these jigs. It's possible that the diamond coat might cause the Sharpie to run or bleed a little bit, in which case it kind of screws things up a little bit. To solve that, would I put a light clear coat on first, then the stripes, then another clear coat? Or could I just paint the stripes on with a brush? It's very simple and easy. It's a small jig, so maybe there's not much difference doing it with a marker or doing it with a brush, that you just zip, 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 turn your hand, 3 more stripes, and you're done. What does that all mean? So epoxy and the buoy enamel that we've used over the years, they're both very expensive. They're both difficult to use for this specific process. So I think with the water-based enamel, with the hardener that we use, with the preparation base coat that we use, it's been durable enough for the walleye head, airhead jigs that we've done. So I think it's going to be a good alternative, a good new way of painting these fluorescent jigs. Mostly my ice fishing jigs, but also some of the panfish stuff that we do, the smaller jigs that we do. So we're going to have to keep an eye on that. I'm sure I will talk more about this. I'm sure, I should really, honestly, the table behind me here, I should set up some cameras and just show everybody as we're painting some of those walleye heads, how I do it, the paint that I'm using, the steps we take to prepare the jig, to put the base coat, and then the layers on top. And then, like I said, for the clear coat, it's the I'm using the diamond coat clear, which is been really happy with that. I think it's super durable. I can't think of anything that would be better to use. And cost-wise, even, it's not terrible. It's not more than I would expect. So, but this jig is a very simple jig. I do enjoy tying it. I could sit here and just tie all afternoon. And it's fun, I think, in the sense that you really feel a sense of accomplishment when you look up and realize, oh, it's only been an hour and I got 7 dozen. You know what I mean? That's exaggerating a little bit, but you sit here an entire afternoon, and sometimes I get up, I get something to eat. Like I said, I attend to the dogs, etc. But you can get a whole bunch tied very quickly. And you look at your rack and they're all just hanging there like little soldiers. And you do feel like you've accomplished a bit. But I'm kind of weird like that, because taking the large, I left it over on my other table, but this is just a sandwich bag of the loose Hackle that I have, but I also have the big gallon size bags. And to tie these jigs, so like I said, so this was the 1/8 head. I'll put the vise real briefly. Let's take a tied one. This is a 1/16 versus a 1/8. So as you can see, definitely a difference in size, right? So the Hackle feathers that we use, I'm picking out the ones that would work properly. So the ones that I was using with the 1/8, this would be probably a little bit too long. It's pushing the length that I really would want for this. So I have to sit down and go through the bag, and I'll separate the hackles, small, medium, large. There's also some here that are like extra tiny, that I like to set those aside as well. But that's just me being weird. I like just it's absolutely no mind. It takes no mind at all to do this task. I'm just looking at the feather. Maybe I'll have a dark paper on the table so I could see the lighter color feathers. That's a short, that's a long, that's a medium, etc. And I'll do that for an hour. And just separate. So then I have enough feathers to sit down and I can tie for a couple days for the different size heads. But yeah, I'm weird that way. To me, that was an enjoyable hour. It was to me, it's productive in regard to preparing for something that I'm tying. So yeah, those are the little things I find enjoyment in. I maybe that's TMI. I guess I told you there's no secrets here when it comes to jig tying. I'll tell you everything. So yeah, you want mindless, brain-numbing type work. That's one of the things that I have to do. Separating my hackle into different size feathers. Talking about feathers, let me real quick. I would be doing a disservice if we didn't talk about this. So I used loose hackle that I have in my inventory. Not 100% sure even where those came from. I have a lifetime of loose hackle. But if you're going to sit down and tie these jigs yourself, just like other jigs that we've tied, don't get fancy fly tying hackle. You can buy some cheap rooster necks. They used to be called Chinese necks. That's all you need. Just a real cheap neck. This bag, I actually have a card down the middle and a neck on each side. It just saves space in my storage. I know these are necks that I've used in the past, so they're open. So I wouldn't, if somebody, I have other tires locally that come by to get materials. So I do keep things packaged new to sell to them when they need it. But just a cheap streamer rooster neck, that's all you need. The majority of this, you're going to use these longer feathers for streamers, for large jigs if you want to add wings and that type of thing. For these ice fishing jigs or panfish jigs, summertime little panfish jigs, you're only really focusing on this bottom section, the actual, this is the neck part, right, where it goes up to the head. And the feathers are much smaller. And again, you're going to pick these off and you're going to separate them into, if you have heads that are 1/8, 1/16, and 1/32, you're going to separate them into small, medium, large. And that is the hackle that I would recommend people go out. Again, don't spend a whole lot of money. We used to be able to buy these for $5 or less. I think they're still $7 or $8, which isn't terrible. You could really spend a lot when it comes to hackle feathers. But that's what I would recommend. Tinsel again is just a medium chenille. Don't go with a terribly thick chenille. And if you used a thinner chenille, if you had a small diameter chenille, you're just going to add an extra wrap or two. But medium is what we're looking for. And again, the thread, the thin thread that you're comfortable tying with, I used the Danville 2/0 round nylon. But I think that's going to do it for us today. You missed a good first show when I tied, 6 or 7 of these and talked for a half hour without recording it. But I appreciate everybody sticking around to this point. As always, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any new content. Feel free to share any of our videos, as it does help increase awareness for the channel. Check out my website, jworthhandtied.com. And until next time, guys, keep tying tight lines. We recorded that time.